They kept the money. I received an envelope with no name on it, which no one wanted to touch. The room was silent, but it wasn't mourning, it was calculation. The lawyer cleared his throat, perhaps uncomfortable with what he had just handed over, and slid the small brown envelope across the table to me. The others remained motionless, not moving an inch. They knew what they had received, 10 million each. They signed hastily, too hastily, as if they knew exactly what was coming. I was the last. When I opened the envelope, there was only one sheet of paper. No instructions, no price, no explanation, but the way everyone looked away told me everything. The signature at the bottom of that page was his, but the words seemed to have been written by someone who knew there would still be war. That day I didn't know it yet, but that sheet of paper I almost threw away was going to drag my family's name all the way to court, and I would be the only one there with nothing to lose and nothing to hide. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I'm 38 years old and I live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm a history teacher at a public school in the Eastern District, the kind of place where you learn to do a lot with a little. My students know they can trust me, and until that morning I believed my life was peaceful enough to continue that way for a long time. I don't live in luxury, but I pay my rent on time, make coffee at home, and walk to work when the weather permits. I like routine. I like silence. The apartment is small, but it protects me. It has too many books piled up and windows that catch the afternoon sun. Nothing there is new, but everything has my name, my rhythm, my choice. It's been years since I've been involved in anything that included the Whitmore name. I distanced myself when I was still young, not out of pride, but out of necessity. Sometimes the peace you find away costs less than the conflict you would endure if you stayed, and over time, I've learned to accept that certain doors really do need to remain closed. When the call from the law firm came, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part knew that sooner or later something would resurface. Nothing stays buried forever. And now, sitting in front of that envelope, surrounded by people who wouldn't look me in the eye, I understood. The past I left behind had just walked in through the front door. In the house where I grew up, the silence was sharper than any word, and it always came after something I didn't quite understand. An innocent question, an untimely attempt at a hug, a comment that wasn't appreciated. It was as if my way of being bothered them, as if I were there by mistake. My father, Richard Whitmore, was the kind of man who would walk into a room and people would straighten up, always impeccably dressed, always with the right words for others, never for me. He treated me like someone tolerating an obligation they didn't ask for. When I spoke to him, it was like talking to someone I'd already decided not to listen to. He never hit me, never yelled, but he never stayed, never cared. My mother, Emily, died when I was 9 years old. Leukemia. The disease progressed quickly and the funeral even more so. I remember holding her hand in the hospital and feeling that it was the last thing I had left. At the burial, as the earth hit the coffin, my father walked away before the ceremony was over. He said he had an appointment with the foundation's board. He didn't even look back. I stood there beside the woman who loved me most, alone with mud-soaked socks and a coat that wasn't mine. From then on, I was left in the care of Margaret, the housekeeper's former housekeeper, who was almost 60 at the time. She lived in the back in a small annex. She taught me how to make tea, fold t-shirts, and polish shoes. But more than that, she was the one who looked me in the eyes for the first time after my mother died. She was a simple woman, strict, but with a kind of firmness that doesn't hurt. The kind of firmness that holds the world in place. I never heard my father ask how I was doing. He never came into my room. He never attended a school meeting. At 13, I asked if I could study at a public school. With ordinary people, he didn't answer. But that same night, the lock on my room was changed. I could still go in, of course, but he could lock it. And he did. The worst memory wasn't a fight. It was my 15th birthday. The house was full. Imported cars parked on the lawn. Waiters serving glasses of juice and expensive canapes. But the party wasn't for me. It was a cocktail party for the foundation my father presided over. As I came down the stairs, wearing the blue shirt my mother gave me the last Christmas we spent together, I heard one of the directors ask, "Who is that boy?" And he replied without hesitation, "A distant cousin of Emily's." I went back to my room and stayed there until the music ended. That's when I understood he didn't want me to exist. I left home at 17, without a fuss, without a fight. I just went. I left a short note and a tidy room. I only took what fit in a wheeled suitcase. Margaret cried, but she didn't try to stop me. She only said, "Be better than them." I persevered. I went to college with scholarships and night jobs. I never asked for help. I never received a call. The years passed, and my name became only mine, far from the overly bright classrooms and hallways that smelled of varnish and hypocrisy. But now, Back in that room with that envelope in my hands, I knew. They didn't call me there out of respect or out of longing or for reconciliation. They called me because something was about to fall apart, and I, for some reason, was the piece they could no longer ignore. The sheet of paper inside the envelope was still folded in three, and while the others discussed the size of the properties and the bank transfers, I kept it there, untouched, as if I could postpone what would come next. But it was too late. The past I buried at 17 had just been unearthed with a signature in blue ink. The official meeting was adjourned, but no one stood up. The lawyers began gathering the papers, avoiding direct eye contact with me. They seemed to know that this wasn't over. I put the envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket, still unopened. It was like carrying an unknown, and at the same time, unavoidable, weight. That's when Claire approached. She was my half-sister on my father's side. Almost my age, but with that trained gaze of someone who grew up hearing that the world was rightfully hers. She had studied abroad, lived in cities where people address each other by their last name. The last time we exchanged words, I was still wearing a backpack slung over my shoulder. "Daniel," she said, her voice low, as if announcing a funeral. "I'm so sorry about Dad." She extended her arms in a hesitant, rehearsed gesture. The hug was cold, formal, more like a greeting at a corporate meeting than any gesture of affection. She continued, "It all happened so fast, you know. He talked about you. Every now and then." I stopped. I looked her straight in the eyes. "He was talking?" Claire didn't hold his gaze. She smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, when he mentioned it, it was always with concern. He said you were different." Before I could answer, another voice came from behind me, firmer. "This is no time to relive old grievances, Claire." It was Charles. Second cousin, lawyer by training, close friend of my father, always in the shadows, always wearing a dark suit, always ready to speak on behalf of someone else, but never on his own behalf. "Daniel," he said, squeezing my hand with unnecessary force, "it was good that you came. The family needs unity right now, and I know your father would be happy to see you. Here." That pause before "here" carried more weight than it seemed. It was as if it were saying, "But not for long." Claire resumed the conversation, now in a more direct tone. "I know the reading of the will was unexpected, but this can be resolved discreetly. No one needs to be harmed." "Harmed?" I asked, still calm. Charles intervened, as if taking control of the situation. "Look, Daniel, that document you received," he made a vague gesture with his fingers, "is probably incomplete. It may not have legal validity. We're talking about a sick, tired man, and you know how these things are. He may have signed anything without understanding what it was." My blood ran cold inside, but I kept a neutral face. Claire took another step closer. "If you want, we can resolve this between us. Before it goes to the notary, before it needs to become public." There it was, the first veiled threat. "And what if I want to read what he left me?" I asked in a low voice. Charles adjusted his shirt cuff. He smiled like someone teaching a student who is lagging behind. "You can. Of course you can, but you need to know that sometimes documents like that have consequences that affect everyone. The foundation, ongoing projects, the family's reputation." Claire finished as if offering a solution. "You're not obligated to carry this. Just give it up. Sign a simple agreement. We can even arrange some compensation. Something fair. Nothing official." The room seemed smaller. The air thicker, and the word compensation kept spinning in my head like a coin tossed in the dark. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. Charles chuckled softly, as if lamenting the naivete of an old acquaintance. "Sometimes, Daniel, those who don't ask for anything are the ones who complicate things the most." The tension rose. I knew what they were doing. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. It was about fear. Fear that that envelope held something that couldn't be explained or hidden. Claire pulled up a chair next to her and sat down. "Do you know what's written there?" "Not yet," I replied. She tilted her head slightly. "Then maybe it's not too late. We can still prevent the damage." The word damage lingered there between us like a crack in the ground about to burst open. They were certain I hadn't read it, and that said a lot. Charles took a card from his pocket and placed it on the table with a light tap, as if concluding a negotiation. "Tomorrow, noon, family office. If you want to talk before, involving lawyers." Claire stood up, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and before leaving, uttered one last sentence, almost like a warning disguised as kindness. "Sometimes knowing too much doesn't bring peace. It brings responsibility." And then they left, like someone leaving a bomb on the table and closing the door slowly. I stood there, alone, the envelope still untouched in my pocket. I knew that whatever was in there, it wasn't about money, it was about truth. It's true that name has always been used to describe a threat. I didn't go straight home. I wandered aimlessly for about 2 hours with the envelope still in my pocket. Its weight growing with each step. I sat on a bench near the station, where nobody knew me. People passed by with bags, cell phones, children in their arms. The world went on as if nothing had happened. And for everyone there, nothing had. I picked up the envelope. I touched the flap with my fingers, but I didn't open it. That night, I couldn't eat. The previous night's breakfast was still in my stomach, untouched. The smell of hot food made me nauseous. I lay on the sofa, still dressed, with the kitchen light on, and stared at the ceiling until the sun rose. The next morning, I called Margaret. It took me days to muster the courage. She now lived in a simple nursing home in Reading, rural Pennsylvania. We had only spoken once years ago, in a brief exchange of Christmas cards. I didn't know if she would remember my voice, but he remembered. "Daniel, is that you, my son?" Her voice, it was still the same, just more tired. "Yes, it's me. I knew it. I dreamt about you this week. You looked hungry, but not for food." We were silent for a few seconds. And then I asked, "Are you well?" I'm the way time allows one to be, neither good nor bad alive." I explained in a few words that I had returned because of the will, that something strange was happening, that I needed to see her. 2 days later, I drove there. The home was clean, unpretentious, smelling of disinfectant and warm soup. She was wearing a purple wool sweater and comfortable shoes. Her hair was whiter than I remembered, and her eyes were the same. She didn't ask me anything. She just slowly extended her arms and hugged me as if I were still 17, as if nothing had happened, as if she knew exactly what was coming. We sat there for almost an hour without any rush, and before I got up, she gripped my hand with surprising force. "If he left something for you, it's because he didn't have the courage to say it out loud. Do you think he regretted it?" She took a while to reply. "Regret is just a name we give it when it's too late." The following week, she died. Heart failure. She didn't suffer. They informed me by phone in a neutral, professional tone. The funeral was simple. I was the only one from the family who showed up. There were no expensive flowers, no speeches, just a light-colored wooden coffin, 3 housekeepers, and me. I stayed until the end. I was the last to leave, the last person to thank her for everything she did for me, even without ever asking for anything in return. When I got home that night, I dropped my keys on the table, and only then did I take the envelope out of my pocket. It was the same as it had been since the meeting. Worn at the edges, the fold slightly crumpled. There was a single sheet of paper inside with my father's firm, direct handwriting. No letter, no dedication, just words that seemed to have been handpicked, as if each one carried a kind of legal and personal weight. I didn't finish reading. Not that night. I only read the first few lines. And I stopped. I put it away again, folded it the same way, and left it on the dresser in the bedroom. During the following nights, I had trouble sleeping. My body was tired, but my mind was alert. I would find myself awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the same page, imagining what I still didn't have the courage to face completely. I started getting distracted during class. Students would ask me simple questions, and I would take a long time to answer. I began avoiding eye contact with classmates. Nobody knew what was happening, and I didn't know how to explain it either. It was as if something was accumulating inside me, slowly, inevitably, something that I could no longer push away. There was one moment in particular, the third sleepless night. I sat on the living room floor, my back against the bookshelf, holding the open envelope in my hand, the sheet of paper in my lap, the dim light of the lamp flickering. And suddenly, without warning, I began to tremble, not from cold, nor from anger. It was a feeling I couldn't name, a kind of emptiness inside, as if everything that sustained me had given way. Margaret's absence, the family's calculated disdain, the way that page seemed to carry more history than I was capable of bearing. I didn't cry out loud. I just closed my eyes and let my head fall against the wall. I took a deep breath, a long one, like someone drowning from the inside out. There I understood something simple. I could no longer run away. The note my father left me wasn't a gesture of affection, it was a belated confession. A trap disguised as justice, an old wound put into writing and left to burst open in my hands. But now Margaret was dead. My mother had been for a long time, too. And those who remained didn't want reconciliation. They wanted silence. I was the only one who could still carry that truth to the end. Even if it cost me the little peace I had gained, I wasn't going to bury that with them. 3 weeks later, at 9 hot a.m., sharp, I was sitting in a meeting room in downtown Philadelphia. Light from outside filtered through the closed blinds, cutting the dark wood table into bands of light and shadow. The clock on the wall was silent, me too. The family lawyer, Henry Millstone, was a methodical man. the type who pronounces each syllable as if it were worth money. His burgundy tie was perfectly aligned, his folders were organized by color and name on the table, and his expression was far too professional for someone dealing with the end of a family. Claire arrived before Charles. She was wearing a light gray blazer and low heels. He walked past me as if we were distant acquaintances who, by accident, had scheduled the same appointment at the same time. "Daniel," she said with a slight nod. "Nothing more than that." She sat down on the other side of the table, opening a small notepad with exaggerated care, as if there was something in there that she already knew would be useful or against me. Charles arrived a minute late without apology. He was smiling, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Good morning, everyone," he said, even before sitting down. "Let's resolve this calmly, I hope." Henry took a deep breath, opened the first folder in front of him, and cleaned his glasses before putting them back on. No unnecessary words, no lingering gazes. The room had 4 chairs, a water pitcher, and 2 pens on the table. The silence inside was almost clinical. You could hear the sound of pages being carefully turned with each new page. Henry would stop, confirm something with his eyes, then continue. Claire crossed her legs. Charles adjusted his cufflinks. I kept my hands in my lap, pressing my fingers against my palms to hide the slight trembling. There was no coffee, no condolences, not even a mention of my father's death. We were there only for what mattered, the fate of what he left behind. And what did he hide? In the middle of the table there was an envelope different from mine, thick, sealed, marked with a thin red ribbon. Henry didn't touch him until halfway through the meeting, but everyone looked at him like he was a grenade. "Before we proceed with the additional clause," the lawyer said, looking directly at me, "I need to confirm that everyone present has received and reviewed the contents of the main will." "Yes," said Claire. "Of course," Charles added impatiently. Henry looked at me. "Senor Whitmore?" I nodded. It wasn't a lie. I had read it, not completely, not everything, but enough to know that that document was going to change what was being built in that room. "Great," said Henry, closing the folder and turning to the sealed envelope. The atmosphere changed. Claire settled into her chair. Charles leaned slightly forward. The envelope was slowly pulled to the center of the table. "This is the extraordinary clause," said the lawyer, his voice firm but lower. "Handwritten, registered under legal witness, and personally delivered to our office last September." He paused. "It wasn't a mistake, it was calculation. It contains specific provisions that are not included in the previously released official version." Claire frowned slightly, as if it were the first time she'd heard of such a thing, but her fingers gripped the edge of the notepad tightly. Charles just smiled, but not slightly, with teeth. Henry glanced at each of us before continuing on. "By express instruction of Richard Whitmore himself, this clause should only be read in the presence of the principal heirs, and more importantly, its reading implies acceptance of its legal validity once opened. Neither party can claim ignorance of its content." Claire spoke quickly. "What does that mean exactly?" Henry stared at her for less than 2 seconds, then he replied, "That means that once I start, there's no going back." Charles tried to laugh, a dry, brief laugh. "Henry, with all due respect," my uncle had his outbursts, "we can't take every note he wrote seriously." "This isn't a ticket," Henry replied. "It's a legally registered and authenticated addendum. And according to Richard himself, it deals with pending matters." The word pendants hung in the air for far too long. I leaned forward slightly. The envelope seemed heavier now than when I came in. Henry broke the seal with a metal stiletto, slowly. The sound of tearing paper was the only sound in the room. He slid the sheet out. He unfolded it carefully. And then he read the first line in silence. It stopped. He looked at us. First Claire, then Charles, then directly at me, and he said in a firm voice, "Before I die, there's a truth I need to put on record. There's no way you can be prepared to discover that the only thing you inherited was a lie that everyone decided to keep intact." Henry glanced at the sheet of paper once more, as if assessing the weight of what he was about to release. "Before I die, there's a truth I need to put on record. This is my final will, made without interference, coercion, or outside influence, with full legal awareness." He took a deep breath. "My children, Claire and Michael, will receive the standard division of assets as per the registered will. However," Claire shifted in her chair, a slight adjustment, almost imperceptible, "there is an item that was removed from the official inventory by myself and kept confidential, a real estate trust associated with the original Whitmore family property, with assets estimated in the last report at $27 million. The silence was absolute. Charles stopped smiling. Henry continued without looking directly at anyone. This fund was created with resources that were not declared in the Foundation's public financial statements. By my decision, it has been funded over 30 years with surpluses, redirected donations, and properties acquired in the names of third parties. Claire crossed her arms, her eyes didn't blink. This fund, along with all associated properties and income, will be transferred in full to Daniel Whitmore, my son, provided that he accepts the conditions of this clause and does not waive the contents of the envelope received. My name seemed to have been thrown like a stone into a frozen lake. Claire let out a muffled sound, half laughter, half a spasm of indignation. Charles leaned forward, his voice higher pitched than usual. Is this a joke? Henry didn't answer. He continued reading. I relinquish this right as reparation, not for blood but for the truth. The document delivered separately contains the legal basis for this transfer and the records that support the origin of the assets. That's when Charles stood up. Quick. No ceremony. Henry, with all due respect, this is completely absurd. There is no basis to validate this type of transfer made outside of the main will. This is irregular. It's not irregular, Henry retorted coldly. It's registered, authenticated, and validated by a Lancaster district judge. The signature was recognized and the document will be attached to the formal reading as a legally binding addendum. Claire, still seated, slowly turned her head toward me. It was you. Her voice was low but firm. You convinced him to do it. You showed up after years and filled his head with nonsense. I didn't reply, I didn't react. Because it wasn't true, but to say that at that moment, it would just be another argument among many. Charles turned to me. He was red not from embarrassment, from anger. This is a blatant attempt to invalidate decades of family management, to tarnish the Foundation's name. You have no idea what you're messing with. Henry interrupted him curtly. Mr. Bennett, I recommend that you restrain yourself. This is still an ongoing legal proceeding. Claire then delivered the first real blow. If he accepts this, we will contest it. We will file a lawsuit for undue influence. We will expose everything. It won't just be a financial dispute, it will be personal. Charles picked up his cell phone and began typing frantically. I have contacts in the local press. If that clause leaks, Daniel's name will be linked to a scandal involving financial embezzlement and family manipulation. We'll see if his reputation at the school survives that. Henry stood up. The meeting had clearly ended. Whatever Mr. Daniel decides to do with the content of the clause and the document will be respected, but I can guarantee that the law has been followed. Claire pointed directly at me. Do you think you've gained anything? You don't know what this piece of paper carries. You're going to be dragged down with it, and when that happens, there won't be anyone left to hold you. She left without waiting for an answer. Charles followed her, still on the phone. I stayed alone in the room for a while, staring at the envelope on the table. My envelope. What I kept for weeks without touching. What was now the line separating silence from truth. Henry began to gather the folders, and before leaving he said, If you want to present the documents, you'll need a lawyer. A good one. They will fight back with everything they have. I nodded without getting up. He stopped at the door. Your father knew this was going to happen, and he still did it? Even so. Henry looked at me with something close to respect, perhaps because for the first time he didn't want to hide it. I stayed there for a few more minutes until the silence weighed more than the air. I put the envelope back in my pocket. No rush, be careful. Like someone holding on to something they can no longer let go of. As I was leaving the building with the wind whipping against the glass of the automatic doors, I received a notification on my cell phone. An email. Subject, formal notification of testamentary objection. Signed by Bennett and Rowe, LLP. The will didn't end anything. It was just the beginning of the war. The hallway was narrow with beige walls and dark wood benches along the sides. There were no windows, just a silent clock marking 9:07 a.m. My lawyer, Thomas Green, was reviewing some papers while I kept my hands clasped in my lap. My palms were damp, my breathing controlled. The clothes I was wearing, light blue shirt, gray blazer, discreet shoes, were chosen to appear neutral, respectable. Nothing that could be used against me. But there nothing was neutral. When the door opened and the officer announced the start of the session, my body moved as if by reflex. I entered the courtroom with firm steps, but my inner self was cracked. To my left, Claire and Charles were already seated side by side with their respective lawyers. They both avoided looking directly at me, but they knew I was there. The room was simple, functional. An American flag in the corner, benches occupied by a few local reporters, 2 law interns with clipboards and the judge, a gray-haired man with a tired and direct expression, who entered without theatrics and sat down as if he didn't want to waste any time. Session open. Case number 482521B. Testamentary challenge in the estate of Richard E. Whitmore. The first half hour was bureaucratic. Names, records, dates. But the real tension arose when the opposing lawyer stood up. "Your Honor," began Jennifer Locke, Claire's lawyer, "we have come to demonstrate that the extraordinary clause presented by Daniel Whitmore was obtained through undue influence over a man in a fragile state of health. Furthermore, its content represents an illegal diversion of assets originally intended for the family foundation." Green stood up calmly, he replied. "The document was registered at the notary's office, authenticated during the applicant's lifetime, and recognized as valid by this court even before the objection was raised. The accusation of influence has no factual basis." Jennifer retorted immediately. "But it has a moral basis, Your Honor." The judge looked up for a brief second. "Morality is not a matter for judgment here, Mrs. Locke. Continue." The hearing proceeded at a steady but intense pace. The foundation's name was mentioned dozens of times. The properties involved, the funds, the beneficiaries. The other side's strategy was clear: to portray me as someone who took advantage of an absent father, manipulated a vulnerable old man, and tried to appropriate what wasn't mine. "Mr. Whitmore," Jennifer said when I was finally called to the podium, "how many years were you estranged from your family?" 21. "And he only returned after his father's death?" "I returned when I was summoned for the reading of the will." She nodded, theatrically restrained. "And before that, did you have any contact with them?" "No." "So you want this court to believe that a sick man, with whom you hadn't spoken for 2 decades, spontaneously decided to hand over to you a fund of over $20 million? Silence. I looked at the judge, then at my lawyer, then at Jennifer. "I didn't ask for anything. I only received it." She stepped forward. She changed her tone. "Or did you seek him out in secret? Did you use old memories to influence his decisions? Did you plant doubts about the other heirs?" "Objection," said Green. "A baseless assumption." "That's true. Rephrase the question." The judge replied firmly. Jennifer took a deep breath. She changed tactics. "Mr. Whitmore, are you aware that the contents of the document supporting your inheritance include statements that could damage the image of your family foundation?" "Yes." "And even so, you chose to present it?" Break. "Yes." "So you prefer money to your family's reputation?" I leaned slightly over the microphone. My voice came out lower than I expected, but firm. I preferred the truth. A few murmurs from the pews. The judge banged his gavel dryly. Silence in the court. That's when they presented the first piece of evidence against me. Copies of old emails extracted from my father's personal files, in which Charles mentioned keeping Daniel away from the estate. Ambiguous passages, but full of venom. They were trying to use them to prove that my reappearance was part of an infiltration strategy, and not a legitimate right. But when it came time for Green to present the original document, the one given to me, the envelope, the handwritten sheet, the notarized signature, the court changed its mind. He placed the folder on the table. He opened it calmly. He took out the sheet of paper in front of the judge and displayed it. "Your Honor, this is the handwritten clause signed by Richard E. Whitmore, registered last September, with 2 legal witnesses and confirmation of sanity by an independent health professional." The judge examined it for a few minutes. The room fell silent. Claire looked away. Charles stared intently at the paper as if trying to dissolve it with his gaze. And then Green added, "Attached to the clause is a sealed letter written by Mr. Whitmore, which clarifies his decision. If the court permits, I would like it to be read aloud." Jennifer stood up, agitated. "Your Honor, this letter was not previously included in the case file. This is an emotional attempt to manipulate the trial." The judge raised his hand, asking for silence. He picked up the sealed letter. He examined the envelope. He looked at me. "Do you recognize this as the document that was given to you?" "Yes, sir." "Did you read it?" "Not until the end." He paused for a long time. He ran his fingers over the seal. And then he said in a firm voice, "The law doesn't reward narrative. It rewards evidence. And if there's a direct explanation of the testator's intention here, it needs to be considered." He looked both ways then at the officer. "We will read the letter in a closed session. The hearing will be suspended for 30 minutes. The hammer struck. Everyone stood up. Claire stepped out quickly, her shoulders tense, her heels clicking hard on the floor. Charles stood still for a moment, looking at me as if he wanted to say something. But he didn't. Green put his hand on my shoulder before we left. "Whatever it is, there's no stopping now." The judge returned with the letter in his hands. He read it all in silence, in front of everyone. None of us had immediate access to the content. Not even Green. We only heard what he read aloud, firmly, with a cadence that seemed to come more from the weight of responsibility than from legal practice. When he finished, he looked up, stared at both sides of the room, and said, "The clause will be upheld. The content is valid. The signature is legitimate, and the testator's intentions are clear. The described inheritance will be transferred according to the expressed wishes. The case is closed." He banged the gavel only once, and the silence that followed lasted longer than any celebration could have lasted. Claire remained seated. Charles clenched his jaw so tightly that his muscles felt like they were about to explode. I just breathed. Nothing changed on the outside, but something inside seemed to give way. As we left the courthouse, the hallways were more crowded than before. Some glances were curious, others judgmental, and one or two respectful. Nobody spoke to me, and they didn't need to. When I passed Claire, she simply turned her face away. But the tension in her shoulders said it all. At that moment, for the first time, she didn't know how to react without a script. Charles left earlier, accompanied by his lawyer. Not a word, not a glance. But the way he held the briefcase against his chest revealed that he hadn't accepted it. He had simply lost. Outside, the sky was cloudy. No rain. No sun, just that neutral gray that doesn't take sides. I took the subway back. Nobody knew what had happened. I was just another tired man, sitting with a leather briefcase on my lap, looking at my reflection in the glass, trying to understand what was left after the truth. Going back home that night was like entering a place that no longer belonged to me in the same way. The walls were in the same place. The carpet still bore the creases of the last chair that had been dragged. But the air had changed. I opened the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of water, and sat on the sofa. No cell phone, no TV. Only the sound of old pipes and the creaking of the wooden floor. The folder containing the documents remained on the coffee table, closed untouched. But now I knew exactly what was there. Over the following days, some effects began to appear. The school called me to confirm my availability for the next semester. There was a different tone. A care in the words someone somewhere had read the local headline. Professor involved in multi-million-dollar inheritance dispute wins case against influential family. Nothing offensive, but it's not welcoming either. On the street, I noticed neighbors giving me two glances. Some waved with forced smiles, others crossed the sidewalk before meeting me. Green sent me a short email. The foundation has removed its name from the records, but the fund will be transferred in 90 days. I suggest choosing an institution to handle the management. And if possible, keep your distance. I didn't reply. A week later, I learned that Claire had left her position as director of the foundation. There was no public announcement, just a discreet exchange of positions. Charles, in turn, had his name linked to investigations into the mismanagement of funds. Nothing confirmed. Nothing that will reach the criminal justice system. But the local press feeds on any sign of decline. I didn't do anything to encourage this. I didn't do anything to stop it either. Deep down, it didn't feel like a victory. It simply seemed like what it was. One of the strangest days was when I returned to the old family home. I didn't go in, I just parked across the street. The gate was still the same tall, black with spiral-shaped iron hoops. The facade seemed smaller than I remembered it. The tree out front, where I used to sit with Margaret on hot afternoon, was dry, as if there was no more room for anything else there. I stood there for 10 minutes with the engine off, until I realized that nothing inside that house could give me what I thought I had lost. When I left, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Days later, I received a plain letter with no return address. Inside, an old photo. Me, my mother, and Margaret sitting on the grass in the backyard. No caption. No words. I kept it in the desk drawer. Not because I need to look at her, but because somehow it reminded me that not everything that has been forgotten is lost. I didn't feel like a winner. Just more lucid than before. A few days later, I went to the school safe. I grabbed the spare key I kept at home, went down to the administrative area, and opened the metal drawer where I kept old tests, minutes, and student records. Deep down, there was a letter my mother wrote when I was 12 years old. Margaret had given it to me years later on the day I left the family home. It was just a piece of paper folded 3 times with the crooked and delicate handwriting of someone who wrote by hand with effort and tenderness. You don't need to look like anyone else to have value. Being different from your father doesn't make you any less. It makes you whole. I saved it again. I closed the drawer. I hadn't gone back there to get anything. I just needed to remember who I was. Before of the inheritance, before of the name, before from the fight. I never moved the money. I left it in the hands of a trusted firm, which sends me quarterly reports that I barely read. The fund still exists. But it doesn't define me. I didn't buy a new house. I didn't move to another city. I continued teaching. The world didn't change just because someone at the end of their life decided to write something different on paper. Sometimes people still recognize me. They stop at the market. They talk about the courage I had. But what they don't know is that for me, courage wasn't about facing the court. It was about going back home after everything and continuing to live as before. With less certainty, with more silence, but still here. I received only one email from Claire. Cold aim. He said he would step away from everything for a while. He didn't apologize. It didn't justify anything. I didn't answer. Some bonds, when they break, don't scream. They simply cease to make sense. One Sunday in October, I returned to the public library I used to frequent as a child. I ran my fingers along the shelves, sat by the window where I used to read, and stayed there for almost an hour without opening a single book. All I did was observe the noises of the place, the sound of pages being turned, the kind of silence that doesn't judge anyone. On my way out, I passed a boy of about 12 years old, reading alone at one of the tables. He was wearing the same kind of cheap headphones that I used to wear at that age, the same look of someone trying to escape through thought. On his backpack, I saw a sticker taped on, "Truth is never comfortable. The truth is never comfortable." She smiled almost imperceptibly. Maybe it took me a lifetime to understand this. But at that moment, it didn't hurt. Nothing was ever the same again, and perhaps that's the fairest thing life could offer me. Some truths don't fix the past, but they prevent it from repeating itself.